Okay.
Okay,
Are you ready to do this?
I am.
Awesome. Welcome, Dr. Robert Saul, to PedChat. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Hope you are.
Yeah, I'm doing well. My first question is, what did you want to be growing up?
Great question. I quickly knew that my sports abilities were not going to measure up to what I wanted to do in terms of baseball and then football. And so then, as I was going through high school and undergoing some challenges, we'll say, in childhood, psychology was where I was aiming for after that. So went off to college wanting to be a clinical psychologist.
You mentioned challenges. Do you mind diving into that a little bit?
Well, in my parents divorced, and I went through a variety and living with my mother and having a father that unfortunately had a problem with alcoholism, and it was difficult. So we moved a lot, and that put a lot of stress on me at a time when stress is not well tolerated, i.e., middle school. And
Mhm.
so having a trusted counselor at the time really made me feel like psychology was where I could do some payback and really be a positive contributor.
So, from clinical psychology to pediatrics, how did that transition happen?
Well, that's interesting too. In college, my well, I went to college thinking I was going to be a psychologist. Uh, Transferred from Duke University to a little school in Colorado Springs called Colorado College, and at that time made the decision to go into medical school. Was also at that time my wife and I were foster parents for children with disabilities, and so I had a very much interest in genetics and birth defects at the time. So as I was making this decision to go into medicine and dealing with issues that families deal with disabilities, I found my interest going toward pediatrics. So I must admit, in medical school, I wanted to do everything I was doing at the time. I wanted to be an internist. I wanted to be a radiologist. I wanted to be a dermatologist. Those kinds of things. And so then I went to Duke University Medical Center for my pediatric training and continued my interest in pediatrics and genetics. After my pediatric training, sought fellowship training in genetics, and this was back in the late 70s, so there were no formal board certified programs back then. You went and trained with somebody.
Hmm.
So I went to a institution called the Greenwood Genetics Center in Greenwood, South Carolina, to do a genetics fellowship. The advantage of doing that is I could do both. I loved general pediatrics, but I also loved the academic challenge of learning genetics, a brand new field, if you will.
Yeah, and the AAP gave you the 2018 David W. Smith Award, I think it was called, for excellence in genetics and birth defects education. That's pretty incredible. How did that award come? I know it's a newer award that the AAP is starting to give out.
Yeah, that award was started in 2010, and some very significant contributors in the field of pediatric genetics have received that. The first awardee was Ken Jones, who is the author of Smith's Patterns of Human Malformations. Uh, I got involved with genetics and got involved with education. Fortunately for me, I got involved with multiple projects through the AAP in genetics and was able to keep those going. Helped edit a AAP policy manual on medical genetics, helped serve on what used to be the section on genetics and birth defects and serve on the committee on genetics. So found myself in the right place at the right time and was a co-director of the AAP's project called Genetics and Primary Care Institute. So a variety of things came together. I'm really honored and humbled that my colleagues extended the award for me this year.
What is the one thing in your genetics research that you found that is going to have the most impact on children?
Ooh, good question. And I'm not sure I can come up with one thing, but let me come up with the thing that I think is most impactful, and that's increased awareness of genetics. People are becoming more and more understanding in the role of genetics, getting comprehensive family histories, understanding that disorders usually do not exist in isolation. They usually exist with some genetic component from the family. And that increased awareness for the families, I think, is critical, because then that translates down to the primary care providers. It's not that there's necessarily a therapeutic intervention that's going to correct the problem, but there's always a therapeutic intervention in terms of supporting the family and making sure they get the services that they need.
You've written a couple books. One was called My Children's Children, and I believe that was the one you wrote, gosh, over a decade ago, right? Because it was conceived after the Columbine high school shootings in Colorado. And this started as an op-ed series of articles, and then it evolved into a parental guide for raising children to be what you call good citizens. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, let me give you some background on that for a second. Okay. After I finished my training, I wanted to be the best doctor I could be, so I just dove in and was trying to do everything that I could. But it wasn't until the early 90s that I realized, so that was about 14 years into my training, that I wasn't paying back to the community. At the same time, I went to a conference where I heard a healthcare futurist by the name of Leland Kaiser say 12 incredible words that have been very impactful for me going forward for anything that happens in our community. And typically some people talk about these as problems in the community. We need to identify that I am the problem, I am the solution, I am the resource. That is, it's not their teenage pregnancy problem, it's not their drug problem, it's my problem. And I need to be a part of the solution. But for that to happen, I need to devote my resources to it. So I heard those 12 words in the early 90s, but didn't know how to translate that into action. Then I went to some community folks in town and said, help me out. What can I do? What do I need to do? And so I got involved in a variety of things. And I was going along and quite selfishly quite proud of my efforts, thinking that, wow, this is really, I'm good. And then Columbine hit, 1999. And seeing kids kill kids just made no sense to me. And I asked the question, could that happen in my town? And the answer was yes. I asked the question, what have I done to make a difference, to make sure that doesn't happen? And the honest answer was, I don't think I've done enough. So I put pencil to paper. We still did that back then, and wrote an op-ed article for the local newspaper. Came up with what I considered to be the 5 steps to community improvement. Learn to be the best parent you could be, get involved, stay involved, which I think are 2 different things. Practice love for others, and understand and exercise forgiveness. After I did that, the horse was out of the barn. I started writing op-ed articles every 2 to 4 weeks for the paper, and over 12 plus years, I wrote over 160 articles based on that theme. And those 160 articles then led to a lot of folks reading them and people saying, well, you need to put that into a book. So hence, My Children's Children, Raising Young Citizens in the Age of Columbine.
That's powerful. What would you tell the pediatricians that are going to be watching this? What would you tell them, or what advice would you give to them as far as how to get involved if they want to jump in, and how to get to that point, as you so awesomely described, getting the horse out of the barn? What are some tips or some motivating words you can say to them?
Well, let me just go through those 5 steps again, because I think it's important to have a paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, first off, pediatrics is advocacy. Anybody that practices in pediatrics has to advocate for their patients, has to advocate for their families, and has to do that out of the walls of their office, because that's where the impact is. So I think it's important that we think through what it really means to be a good parent. And I spend a lot of time in the book talking about that. And I chose my words carefully. Parenting is a constant learning experience, and we can always do better. And everyone has different capabilities. So that first step is learning to be the best parent you can be. So always learning, always striving to be better, and recognizing that each of the patients, the families that we deal with, has different abilities, and we need to sort of tailor our responses to that. The second step then, in terms of getting involved, like you were asking specifically about, I think each community, each practice, each individual has unique opportunities. So it's tough for me to say specifically, do this or do that. But I think they're really out there. And if you look, listen, I'm amazed at just when I watch the local news, pick up the local newspaper, talk to my parents, at the opportunities that I could have picked up on at every step along the way. And I must admit, there's been some places where I got involved and then switched gears at different fork in the road. And that's what you need to be able to do, need to be able to adapt to change. But then the important thing is, sometimes it's easy to get involved, but then you really have to stay involved in some way, shape, or form. Doesn't mean you have to stay involved with the same project. You don't have to stay involved with the food bank for 20 years. You might help set it up and then do something else. But it's important that you stay involved, because the community wants to see you as someone that's out there helping. The fourth step, love for others, is sort of self-explanatory, but it amazes me in today's society how we have sort of lost track of that. Citizens, one of the definitions of citizens is people that take care of each other. And that's what I'm talking about when it's raising people to be good citizens. And that's love for others. That's always understanding that we're no better than anybody else. And in our toxic political environment, that's very difficult, but we have to be the role models for that. Conflict resolution does not exist in a environment of hate or intolerance. You have to be able to listen and learn. And then the last is forgiveness. And I love if folks haven't read it, there's a great little book by Mitch Albom called Tuesdays with Maury, talking about Maury Schwartz, his professor in college, when he talks about, gave him life lessons as Maury Schwartz was dying with ALS. He talks about forgive yourself first. Forgive yourself for what you're thinking. Forgive others and do it now. So I've tried to incorporate some of that. And remember that forgiveness is not just personal. In many ways, it's communal. An example here in South Carolina is several years ago, after the horrible church massacre at AME Emmanuel Church in Charleston, where the 9 people were gunned down. Finally, there was some acknowledgement of a communal responsibility, and the Confederate flag was taken down. One might argue, I didn't do it, it wasn't me. But as a community, we have a responsibility to understand the whole importance of forgiveness.
Where is pediatrics headed?
Where is pediatrics headed? It is onward and upward. I am so excited about where pediatrics is headed. And let me use the example of the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's always had very enlightened leaders. And the new leader, Karen Remley, sees and is continuing to shepherd the organization in an incredible upward trajectory. I am so excited about where people are and how people understand the importance of advocacy and moving on. For example, the AAP Federal Legislative Advocacy Conference, I'm sure I got the name specifically wrong, but that was just held earlier this month, was sold out. People from all over the country want to come and learn how to advocate and make a difference in the lives of children. And the AAP is always out at the forefront in terms of looking at what can make a difference in terms of policy statements, and they can be as scientific as one might see, or as community policy oriented as one might see. And I think that's important, because what we do in pediatrics should always be science-based.
Mhm.
That's what makes that's what makes us scientist physicians. We learn science, we apply science in a practical way that can make a difference in the lives of the children and families that we deal with.
That's what's amazing about pediatrics, is that you have a chance to mold these children's lives, at least assist in that, right? You can play a huge role, a massive role in a child's life.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of there's been an interesting initiative the time frame I'm specifically lacking, but it was in the early 2010s. The American Academy of Pediatrics set up a task force to look at early brain and child development in terms of understanding early brain and child development in terms of the new science that's out there. And I'll get back to that in a minute, but to jumping ahead, so much of what we do in terms of adult disease and the money we spend in adult disease occurs because of what happens in childhood.
Mm-hmm.
So we talk about adult onset diseases for people like myself. They're really adult manifest diseases, manifest from issues that developed in childhood. So the work of the Early Brain and Child Development Initiative, a technical statement and a policy statement, was tremendous in terms of trying to understand the stresses and the brain changes and the chemical changes and what we now call the epigenetic changes that happens with gene expression based on childhood experiences.
Yeah, it's extremely powerful stuff. So what are some key takeaways for the pediatricians watching this, particularly as it relates to the dichotomy between impacting children's lives, as we just talked about, and the current state of the healthcare system?
Oh, well, I think that pediatricians always have to be at the forefront of advocating on behalf of children and making sure that we're getting the care that children need, that we need to fight for Medicaid, we need to fight for the CHIP reauthorization program, and some of those things are happening. We need to fight for the benefits not being taken away from children. I think so many of the politicians talk about, well, we always are helping children. But if you're helping children and not helping families, you're not helping children. It's a unit. It's a unit together. And let me back up for a minute to some of the early science, because I think it helps in terms of as we try to understand this. One of the things that came out of the Early Brain and Child Development Initiative, and from based on science even before that, was what they identified as sort of the three stresses of childhood. There's positive stress, there's tolerable stress, and there's toxic stress. Tolerable stress is what you and I are doing right now in terms of being in a stressful environment, trying to talk to each other and not trip over our words and other things like that.
Yeah.
Or getting a shot, like I went to my doctor earlier this week, and not experiencing too much pain and accepting it. Positive stress is what gets us through things and what helps us grow. Positive children have a lot of positive stress, and that's important. Tolerable stress is more negative influences, say the loss of a parent or divorce or other things like that, but there's still significant support systems in place to make that stress tolerable, to make the individual and the family help to be able to grow through that. Toxic stress is when you have very negative experiences and there's not the support that we need. And the landmark study that looked at all that was the so-called ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And then they found out the more adverse childhood experiences someone is exposed to in life, the more likely they are to have at-risk behaviors later in childhood, and certainly have increased onset of adult diseases, various risk-taking disorders, and a variety of things.
When the parents come in with their child, let's say it's their 1 or 2 year old well child visit, so you're at the stage where you can definitely continue to mold, right, or start to mold, and practice preventive medicine in particular. What are some things that you do to establish a rapport with the parent and thus shape it throughout the family versus looking at it just as a patient, a singular patient?
Well, it's obviously that's what sort of defines the pediatric relationship is those early years in terms of the family meeting with the patient and the parents in terms of establishing that trusting relationship on both sides of the equation. So you have an understanding of what the stresses and strains that family is dealing with, and they understand and trust the advice and the counsel that you're giving them. So a lot of it is making sure you're establishing that trusting relationship. One of the specific things I think we start early, and it's not me, there's been an initiative out there called Reach Out and Read for a while that was set up. But I like to, and there's another initiative looking at word gaps and try to make sure that we enhance the environment for children. My 3-word mantra early on is talk, read, sing. I want you to continually be talking to the child. Then I want you to sing to the child. Then I want you to read to the child. And then after you're done with that, I want you to do it again. I want you to talk, read, sing. Because we now know, and I don't think it's necessarily hyperbole, but we now know that really does help shape some early childhood brain development and some connections and some wiring and some chemical changes that can make a difference. At the same time, a lot of what's done in those early years that you talked about at 0 to 1, 1 to 2, is screening tests, screening surveys to see what challenges the family might be facing. Are there challenges? Is mom suffering from possible depression? Are there food challenges? Is this a single parent family? What's going on in the environment? Because sort of one of the key ingredients for early childhood experience and a positive outcome is what we call safe, stable, nurturing relationships. So it's key that we work to provide the support for those. That if we identify an at-risk family, that we're not preaching to them. We want them to know that we're here to support them, and we are going to use whatever services we can to help them in that struggle going forward. We don't have magic, but we certainly understand and want to make sure that they are a part of what we can do to help them.
No pressure, but you have a lot of books behind you. So what are 1 or 2 books that you would recommend for the audience?
Well, I'm not sure any of the books here in my office I would recommend. And this is going to sound self-serving, but let me talk about a book that's coming out that's going to be published by the American Academy of Pediatrics. It's going to be coming out hopefully next month or in June. Co-authored by Andy Garner from Cleveland and myself, called Thinking Developmentally, Nurturing Wellness in Childhood into Lifelong Health. That book, we think, is going to be of critical importance, and we're obviously, we spent 3 years on this project, so we have a vested interest in it. We think is going to be a significant factor in children's health and advocacy going on. Let me explain. The book is divided in 2 sections. The first section is basically taking all the science, the neurodevelopmental science. I talked about the ACE study. I talked about, positive stress, tolerable stress, toxic stress. We spend 5 chapters looking at all the science that goes into what makes people turn out certain ways. I mean, we think about our bodies as sort of a black box. You and I might take the same input and have different reactions. What was going on inside that box? So a lot of the neurodevelopmental science right now is looking at inside the box and trying to understand that. Well, that's nice. That's great. And that's important. But then the question is, how does that translate? What do we do with it? What does it mean in terms of children? What does it mean in terms of parents? What does it mean in terms of society? What does it mean in terms of policymakers? And what does it mean in terms of the practice of pediatrics? So that book will, we think, will be something that'll be, we'd like to think it'll, one, be a go-to book for pediatric residents. And number two, might help us think about how to rechange our paradigm in terms of medical education. Medical education now looks at adult diseases as adult onset. We think they're adult manifest. So we think we need to look more developmentally, think developmentally through what's happening in the life over the lifespan.
And this book is called.
And I should emphasize, but I hate to do this because it gives a shout out to my OB colleagues. What happens between conception and birth matters also. So we need to make sure as pediatricians we're tuned into that as much as possible also.
If you could go back and tell your 25-year-old self something, if you could give your 25-year-old self one piece of advice, what would it be?
Well, take a little more time and smell the roses. I mean, but you know, I grew up in an era where at 25, I was in residency, or I was in medical school, and when I was 25, if you didn't complete your education, you were more than likely going to be in the Army and in Vietnam. So there was no debate. You had your nose to the stone, and there was no rose-smelling time. You were going to keep that exemption that you were granted for educational purposes and stay on that straight and narrow path. When I finished training and got into private practice, I guess I wish I had sort of taken a little more time, a little more family time, and just step back a little more. But it was still hard. I mean, I came out of residency again in an era where you worked hard. I mean, and when I got into private practice, I was on call every third night. And I thought that was great. I couldn't believe how much time I had. And I was on call every third weekend. I thought, wow, this is amazing. But I wish I'd sort of, even with that, I wish I'd taken some more time and backed off a little bit.
What does the day in the life of a pediatric manager / leader like yourself look like? How many pediatricians do you have under you, and how do you teach and nurture them as they get out of residency and grow as a doctor?
Well, it's a constant learning experience for me. I've been in this role now a little over 5 years. And right now, my role is about half clinical, half administrative. The Division of General Pediatrics here at the Children's Hospital in Greenville Health System has about 30 plus pediatricians. And some of those folks are sort of fairly autonomous in terms of the pediatric hospitalists and the folks that work in the nursery. Some of those folks are sort of more under my wing per se, that work in our outpatient clinics that we have. And I precept in clinics where we have medical students and we have pediatric residents, and we have med peds residents. I actually spend 3 half days a week working in as a primary care provider in a complex care clinic for children that are medically fragile. And I think that diversity of experience keeps me fresh and honest. I always feel like there are never enough hours in the day when I have my quote administrative time. It always spills over into my time at home, because one other role I have is we have 3 institutional review boards here, and I'm the chair of one of those. And there's always a fair amount of effort exerted with keeping that going. So, but it's great. I mean, I really enjoy it. It's one of the things I always want to make sure that I'm sitting down with the folks, understanding what we're doing right, understanding what we can do better, what their goals are, and how can I make that happen? How can I help facilitate them in going along. Because a lot of the youngsters say, how do I do this? What do I do? And I said, one of the important things I think you can do is always be on the lookout and never be afraid to go down a road and then realize it might have been the right road. If it's the wrong road, that's okay. Go down another road. Get involved with the American Academy of Pediatrics. There's multiple initiatives. Get involved with your local chapter, your state chapter, because there's just so many projects that are going on, and there's so many committees, sections, and councils with the AAP that you can be a part of that can make a great difference for the AAP, for children, for families, and for yourself professionally. Because I think that as we talk about physician burnout, and we talk about, burning the candle at both ends, oh, I can't do this and I can't do that. I think one of the biggest things we lose track of, and I'm understanding more and more out, is if you always put caring at the top of your list, if that's your primary goal, is caring for your patients, and you always understand that's your driving force, I think that can make sure you don't get too bogged down in all the stuff that we have to do as doctors.
You mentioned that it's important for families to be together, especially in this digital world. What did you mean by that?
It's like when you have when you have a business meeting, or anyone has a staff meeting. If you're looking at your device and checking your emails, you're not listening. You're not present. You're not being a positive contributor. And to effectively talk, you have to be an even more effective listener. Mm-hmm. To understand where people are.
For example, or no, you go ahead.
Our institution here is a big proponent in what's called conscious leadership. That you have to be open, committed to learning, and curious, versus closed, defensive, and committed to being right. And they view that as sort of a line. Sometimes you're below the line, sometimes you're above the line. And it's naive to think you're always going to be above the line. The point is you just need to know where you are. Mm-hmm. If at some point you're in a staff meeting and you're saying, I can't believe how stupid they are, just say, okay, wait a minute. Maybe I'm not being as receptive as I should be here, and let's move my awareness and try to be a better listener and try to be a better contributor.
Well, Dr. Robert Saul, this has been an absolute pleasure. How can people get in touch with you?
My email is rsaul, R-S-A-U-L, at GHS, Greenville Health System.org. So rsaul at GHS.org. Also have a website, mychildren'schildren.com.
Well, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure too. I've very much enjoyed it, and I appreciate the opportunity to do this.